Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
During the past few days, elements of the Chinese army have been brutally suppressing popular and peaceful demonstrations in China. There's been widespread and continuing violence, many casualties, and many deaths. And we deplore the decision to use force, and I now call on the Chinese leadership publicly, as I have in private channels, to avoid violence and to return to their previous policy of restraint. The demonstrators in Tiananmen Square were advocating basic human rights, including the freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association. These are goals we support around the world. These are freedoms that are enshrined in both the U.S. Constitution and the Chinese Constitution. Throughout the world, we stand with those who seek greater freedom and democracy. This is the strongly felt view of my administration, of our Congress, and most important, of the American people. In recent weeks, we've urged mutual restraint, nonviolence, and dialogue. Instead, there has been a violent and bloody attack on the demonstrators. The United States cannot condone the violent attacks and cannot ignore the consequences for our relationship with China, which has been built on a foundation of broad support by the American people. This is not the time for an emotional response, but for a reasoned, careful action that takes into account both our long-term interest and recognition of a complex internal situation in China. There clearly is turmoil within the ranks of the political leadership as well as the People's Liberation Army. And now is the time to look beyond the moment to important and enduring aspects of this vital relationship for the United States. Indeed, the budding of democracy, which we have seen in recent weeks, owes much to the relationship we have developed since 1972. And it's important at this time to act in a way that will encourage the further development and deepening of the positive elements of that relationship and the process of democratization. It would be a tragedy for all if China were to pull back to its pre-1972 era of isolation and repression. Mindful of these complexities, and yet of the necessity to strongly and clearly express our condemnation of the events of recent days, I'm ordering the following actions. Suspension of all government-to-government sales and commercial exports of weapons. Suspension of visits between U.S. and Chinese military leaders. Sympathetic review of requests by Chinese students in the United States to extend their stay. And the offer of humanitarian and medical assistance through the Red Cross to those injured during the assault. And review of other aspects of our bilateral relationship as events in China continue to unfold. The process of democratization of communist societies will not be a smooth one, and we must react to setbacks in a way which stimulates rather than stifles progress toward open and representative systems. And I'd be glad to take a few questions before our cat. I believe the forces of democracy are so powerful, and when you see them as recently as this morning, a single student standing in front of a tank, and then, I might add, seeing the tank driver exercise restraint, I'm convinced that the forces of democracy are going to overcome these unfortunate events in Tiananmen Square. On the commercial side, I think that it's important to keep saying to those elements in the Chinese military, restraint. Continue to show the restraint that many of you have shown. And I understand there are deep divisions inside the Army. So we're putting the emphasis on that side of it. Yeah.
Current regime.
I don't want to see a total break in this relationship. And I will not encourage a total break in the relationship. This relationship is, when you see these kids struggling for democracy and freedom, this would be a bad time for the United States to withdraw and pull back and leave them to the devices of a leadership that might decide to crack down further. Some have suggested I take the ambassador out. In my view, that would be 180 degrees wrong. Our ambassador provides one of the best listening posts we have in China. He is thoroughly experienced, and so let others make proposals that, in my view, don't make much sense. I want to see us stay involved and continue to work for restraint and for human rights and for democracy. And then down the road, we have enormous commonality of interests with China, but it will not be the same under a brutal and repressive regime. So I stop short of suggesting that what we ought to do is break relations with China. And I would like to encourage them to continue their change. Yes?
Mr. Bush, you're saying right now.
That we support their quest for democracy, for reform, and for freedom. And there should be no doubt about that. And then in sending this message to the military, I would encourage them to go back to the posture of a few days ago that did show restraint and that did recognize the rights of the people and that did epitomize what that Chinese leader told me, that the Army loves the people. There's still vivid examples of that.
Should the students go home? Should the students stop trying to
I can't dictate
for action on the part of this country.
I've told you what I'm going to do. I'm the president. I set the foreign policy objectives and actions taken by the executive branch. I think they know, most of them on Congress, that I not only a keen personal interest in China, but that I understand it reasonably well. I will just reiterate to the leaders this afternoon my conviction that this is not a time for anything other than a prudent, reasoned response. And it is a time to assert over and over again our commitment to democracy, emphasize the strength that we give to democracy in situations of this nature. And I come back to the frontline question here. I do think this change is inexorable. It may go a couple of steps forward and then take a step back, but it is on the move. The genie will not be put back in the bottle, and so I am trying to take steps that will encourage a peaceful change, and yet recognize the fact that China does have great pride in its own history, and my recommendations are based on my knowledge of Chinese history. So I would argue with those who want to do something more flamboyant, because I happen to feel that this relationship is vital to the United States of America, and so is our adherence to democracy and our encouragement for those who are willing to hold high the banner of democracy. So we found, I think, a prudent path here. Yeah.